Good evening, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East Studies and Middle East and Islamic Studies program. And I am extremely delighted to be here today because we have a very special guest whom I will introduce in just a couple of minutes. This is our annual keynote speaker. And before we move to the lecture, I would like to share a few things. At this point, I would like to stop talking and ask you to help me welcome Dr. Simon.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank George Mason University for this kind invitation. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, good. And to Professor Haddad for his generous introduction. I really appreciated that. My bio is too long to read because I'm really old and I can't hold a job for very long. It's kind of a problem. Okay, the other thing that I should point out is that I'm not a proper academic, so that's going to shape my remarks. I'm at this stage not a proper national security practitioner either. It's even I'm even more ill-suited to this because academically, my graduate work was on the Roman Near East, and I spent, all too many years working on that. I don't think it was entirely irrelevant, though, because, my specialty was intercommunal relations in second-century Palestine, which is just really a concatenation of intercommunal rioting and clamoring by communities within Palestine at that time for the intervention of outside powers on their behalf. So second century Palestine was actually somewhat eerily reminiscent of the modern Middle East, or at least the parts of it that I've worked on since I came into the State Department back in the early 1980s, and my first posting was in Tel Aviv during the war in Lebanon, which we called Vietnamowitz. Maybe some of you will get that joke. It still cracks me up when I think about it. Anyway, the problem with this, I'm going into this big preamble because, those who are policy analysts are going to be a bit dissatisfied with my remarks. Those who are proper academics will probably find them disappointing, and practitioners probably will find them quite dismaying. I don't know if there are any practitioners in the room, but I am what I am. So I'm going to focus primarily on the past here, basically to set the stage for what I hope will be a lively Q&A about the more recent past, I suppose, and the future. My prejudice, if I have one, is really embodied in the title of the talk, which is U.S. engagement in the Middle East, past, present, and question mark. Because I think things are up for grabs. So to get to the Q&A as expeditiously as possible, I'm going to lay out a series of propositions about the United States and the Middle East in the past, and then we can take it from there. The first is that before 1973, U.S. involvement in the Middle East was minimal, really. Studies of cognitive bias tend to show that spatial or temporal proximity influences perceptions of importance, salience. Now, this is a kind of a wonky point, but it occurs to me whenever I encounter colleagues and students who think that recent U.S. involvement in the Middle East is somehow primordial. I'm not saying that there has been no involvement, obviously. The Jefferson and Adams administrations fought a war in North Africa. The U.S. supplied weapons and mercenaries to Ottoman armies while drenching the region in missionaries, their pieties, and occasionally good works. America unwittingly incited anti-colonial sentiment via clumsy Wilsonian meddling, but quickly reverted to support for British colonial rule. Americans surveyed oil deposits, but the number of U.S. officials involved and the amount of time and energy expended by the U.S. government in these activities was limited. The region was, after all, largely a British concern and to a lesser degree a French one. The U.S. was more focused on opening Japan and China in the 19th century than fooling around with Arabs. The collapse of British power and Cold War geopolitics drew in a very reluctant United States, and I do mean reluctant. In the fall of 1947, for example, the argument against supporting the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states was that the Arabs would immediately push the Jews into the sea. They would then need to be rescued by the United States, it generally being understood that a second Holocaust would not be counted as a foreign policy success. But the U.S. had other more pressing jobs at that moment, like staving off communist penetration of Western Europe and building a multilateral defense structure against the specter of Soviet invasion after the U.S. had largely demobilized. Truman decided in favor of partition anyway because of interlocking moral and political concerns and the expectation that Israel would carry out its own version of partition no matter what arrangement the UN chose to bless. Britain tried to hold on in the region outside of Palestine, despite the devastating consequences of World War II for Britain's economy. And in 1956, under Prime Minister Anthony Eden, London even tried to reenact its conquest of Egypt in 1882 by seizing the Suez Canal and toppling Egypt's charismatic leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. But an outraged Eisenhower cut the British off at the knees. Eden's London Times obituary acidly observed that he had been the last to believe that Britain was a great power and the first to show that she was not. When public support for Britain's military position east of Suez finally evaporated in the late 1960s, London declared its intention to withdraw militarily from the Gulf. This time, an enraged Lyndon Baines Johnson, overextended in the Western Pacific, threatened to withdraw support for Sterling if Britain went ahead with withdrawal. But it was a done deal. Sometimes you just can't win. Anyway, with Britain out of the picture, security responsibility fell to the U.S. The point here is that the U.S. had had the good sense not to seek it. On this point, there is some countervailing evidence of an enthusiasm for engagement, but on the whole, it was restrained and on occasion even cognizant of U.S. incapacity, or as John Foster Dulles put it, lack of sophistication. Yes. Accordingly, the U.S. did its best to outsource these responsibilities. The outsource option was available because during the Cold War, the U.S. had pliable, dependent regimes in the region, for the most part conservative monarchies, that it could depend on. Saudi Arabia and Iran, in particular, two countries you can really rely on in a pinch, were deputized to handle duties that the United States didn't have time for. Many in the room will recognize this as the Twin Pillars policy. After 1973, the roster of protégés grew to include Egypt, eager to get on with an economic opening that would soon create thousands of local millionaires in a riotous orgy of crony capitalism. And Israel, which had taken a serious beating in the October 1973 war and was feeling particularly insecure, so they joined up too. They needed a hug, and the U.S. was there to provide it. Compared to the Soviets' ragtag network of regional alliances, Washington's circle of friends looked pretty good. Of course, there were serious exceptions, as when the Twin Pillars united to quadruple the price of oil and plunge the United States into a ruinous recession. But nothing is perfect. We understand that. Apart from that, it looked good because the regional tableau entailed little or no need for direct intervention. Okay, it's true in a non-trivial way that the U.S. helped engineer a coup in Iran that toppled its elected leader in 1953 and flirted with seditious plotters in Syria in 1957 and Iraq in 1963. But apart from being hornswoggled by squabbling Lebanese politicians into landing Marines in Lebanon in 1958, the U.S. didn't see a need for military intervention. It looked as though the U.S. had managed to ride out Britain's ultimate untimely defection and could focus on initiatives with greater strategic weight involving the Soviet Union and China. In 1979, the environment in which the U.S. operated changed drastically with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. One of the two pillars was simply no longer there, and the other pillar had its weaknesses. The U.S. was thrust from Eden. The question in the wake of revolution, how to deal with Iran, became the recurring vexing issue for the United States that it remains today, decades later. It destroyed the Carter administration, which was so focused on doing the Lord's work, that is, bringing peoples of Abrahamic faiths into a warm embrace at Camp David, that it completely missed the snowballing threat to the Shah of Iran, the very linchpin of America's strategic position in the Persian Gulf. Unlike the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt negotiated at Camp David, that is, between two states that had long since stopped fighting each other and were both American clients, the fate of the Shah carried real consequences for the U.S. position in the region. After the revolution, it fell to the Reagan administration to clear away the rubble and start again. His instincts were intriguing. For example, he apparently colluded with Iran during the 1980 presidential campaign and then secretly sold weapons and spare parts to Iran in the mid-1980s in the hope not just of getting hostages freed, but of a broader rapprochement with Iran that he expected would hasten the collapse of the regime and restore America's erstwhile friendship with Iran. Toward the end of the decade, this sort of approach worked with the Soviet Union. Once the deaths of Andropov and Chernenko had cleared the way for Mikhail Gorbachev. But Ayatollah Khomeini was no Gorbachev. No, he was not. So Reagan's strategy didn't work. Now this view, this is the truth in advertising, part of the talk. This view runs somewhat counter to the prevailing reading of that era, which portrays Reagan's eagerness to transfer weapons to Iran in the mid-1980s as motivated by a lachrymose concern for the hostages then held by Iran's allies in Lebanon. Teary sentimentality, intellectual incapacity, and managerial incompetence, rather than strategic logic, underlay the initiative on that view. Well, maybe. The Reagan administration certainly wasn't a tight ship, and Reagan was a kind of a sentimentalist, I think, and he seems to have been somewhat incurious. And it is probably the case towards the end of his second term that dementia that had eclipsed his public life a bit later on was already beginning to have an effect. But the archival material in favor of my reading, I guess, is too insistent on strategic motives simply to ignore. The ugly end of the initiative led the U.S. into a tragic partnership with Iraq. Washington courted Saddam Hussein, overlooked his dark deeds, tried to enmesh him in trade agreements, all to prop him up against a bulwark against a weaker Iran emerging from post-revolutionary purges and a wholesale political and social reboot while engaged in a highly destructive war with Iraq. So in strategic situations like this one, where America's oil, as one of my first bosses at the State Department just, was explaining where babies come from, and he said, well, it's our oil. I suppose, on one level he was right. Anyway, in a situation like that where America's oil was in another country's backyard and the U.S. had to make sure that none of its neighbors could steal it, The sensible thing to do was to ensure that no one out in that neighborhood gets strong enough relative to the others so that he can take your oil away. So you have a choice. You can boost the weaker neighbor against the stronger one to even things out. Power balancing that's what you call it in the classroom. Or you boost whichever neighbor seems quiescent against the one who seems hostile. You call that threat balancing when you're in class. In this case, the U.S. was busily threat balancing against Iran rather than power balancing against Iraq, and this turned out to be a serious mistake, actually. But it was a weird moment. After decades of sensible American restraint, the Reagan administration had jumped into the region with both feet, starting with an intervention into the Lebanese Civil War, of all things, to create peace in the Middle East, humble Soviet allies, and relieve Lebanon's agony, as Reagan put it. But most of all, to show that the U.S. was a force to be reckoned with and could be relied upon to meet its obligations. Syria and Iran agreed that the U.S. was a force to be reckoned with it, and they reckoned with it, but in a way that forced the Reagan administration's humiliating exit from Lebanon amid some truly surreal atmospherics. The preoccupation with reputation and credibility that drove the intervention in Lebanon then seems suddenly to disappear. Now, successive administrations, ones that followed Reagan, as we'll see, tried and failed either to subdue Iran or to co-opt it. It's a leitmotif. Okay, but we'll come back to it. A second shock arrived in 1990, Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, which coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Saddam's aggression exemplifies what can go wrong when you have balanced against an apparent threat, in this case Iran, when you should have been balancing against the greater power in Baghdad. Saddam, of course, had just made his own colossal mistake by launching an invasion of Kuwait just when the United States had an enormous army in Central Europe that was all dressed up with nowhere to go. But it was too late at that stage for a mid-course correction. The Bush administration responded decisively, possibly too decisively. I say this because there's evidence to suggest that Saddam was prepared to withdraw unilaterally from Kuwait once the air campaign was making itself felt. If you recall, there was an air campaign that lasted for about a month that preceded the ground campaign in the spring of late winter and early spring of 1991. This seemed to be the view of the intelligence community. So the intelligence community was saying, it's pretty likely that Saddam is just going to pull out. But the administration was nevertheless determined to embark on a ground campaign, thereby lashing the United States to the Iraqi mast for the next 28 years. It was a very important thing historically. Well, the tyranny of path dependencies tightened its grip in the ensuing decade because the U.S. under Clinton acted per its then apparently hegemonic status, aiming to corral both Iranian and Iraqi power and subordinate both to U.S. regional objectives. Given that the administration's situation which I should explain, and that might not be obvious. The Clinton in his first term in foreign policy and defense issues was weak and insecure. It was a deeply burdened first couple of years as he tried to get his balance. And in that setting, the magnificence of Bush's victory over Saddam Hussein was crippling, really, for Clinton and made it impossible for him to take any actions, really, that might have been perceived as derogating from Bush's brilliant success, his lightning victory against Iraq. So as a result, the Clinton White House, which liked to say that Saddam was in the box, and that was the term of art, especially when dealing with the media, actually the administration itself was in the box because it was stuck having to deal with this unsettled, unresolved issue, serious issue with Iraq. So the U.S. took the lead on enforcement of economic sanctions against Iraq, which would ultimately pulverize Iraq's middle class and ultimately make it harder to govern once Saddam was gone. In the meantime, a shocking Iranian attack against a U.S. base in Saudi Arabia in 1996 nearly caused a war between the U.S. and Iran, but it was averted because the U.S. and Saudi Arabia were slow to react, and in 1997, Mahmoud Khatami was elected as president of Iran, and that enabled the United States to escape its post-Khobar predicament. Okay, so to complicate things further, the Saudis began to push the United States military out of the kingdom at that stage, to the delight of Qatar, which offers its territory as a sprawling airbase for U.S. use. With its newly discovered gas deposits, Doha saw a need for a bodyguard. The fact that the invitation was a poke in Saudi eyes with a sharp stick made the deal all the more compelling to Qatar's rulers. It's worth clarifying that in this case, the U.S. didn't get the shove from the Saudis because the U.S. was too soft on Iran. The U.S. got the shove from the Saudis because the Saudis were afraid that the United States would drag them into a war with Iran they didn't want, or into a clash with conservative public opinion within the kingdom. Okay, so the bottom line is neither Iran nor Iraq submitted to the United States. By the end of the decade, there were just three possibilities, at least vis-a-vis Iraq. One was to give up and bring Iraq back into the regional order. The other was to figure out how to make sanctions work, or continue to work. Or third, kill Saddam. Those were the three options that emerged by the end of the Clinton administration. In 2001, in the first year of the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, a third shock radiated from the Middle East. 9/11 triggered an awesomely deranged response, understandable under the circumstances, which resolved the question of Iraq in favor of the kill Saddam option. This was the high watermark of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. It was our Suez. It was the moment George Bush turned out to be the last person who thought the U.S. was a great power and the first to show that it was not. John Maynard Keynes said that, quote, madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. If he only knew. The voices in the air called for democratization and modernization, if necessary at the point of American bayonets. In this case, the academic scribbler was none other than Princeton's Bernard Lewis, the author of Why They Hate Us and What Went Wrong. On a more practical level, according to the president, the U.S. had to kill Muslim militants over there so as not to confront them over here. Ironically, this reasoning was only naturally adopted by Iran in defending its operations in Syria. According to Ayatollah Khamenei in 2017, quote, if the Islamic State were not stopped, we would have to fight them in Kermanshah and Hamadan, provinces in western Iran. I was really struck by that. Iranians were obviously as susceptible to this argument as Americans were. At the time Khamenei made this claim, 87% of the Iranians supported Iran in its fight against the Islamic State in Syria. In the U.S., this was this reasoning was something that both right and left could really get behind. Now, in strategic terms, as many people have pointed out, millions of people have pointed out, the invasion of Iraq was a serious mistake. In this case, threat balancing once again beat power balancing. Iraq might have appeared to be a threat, but after 10 years of sanctions, it had no power to hurt U.S. interests. Iran at that point had the greater power, if only in relative terms. Yet the U.S. put its thumb in the scale in Iran's favor rather than balancing against it and took down the weaker state. Here, the story of U.S. engagement in the Middle East that began with Reagan begins to wind down. The U.S. ultimately disengaged militarily from Iraq, but broader disengagement proceeded in fits and starts, owing in part to the last gasp of liberal interventionism, that is, in the form of the the NATO intervention in Libya, and the reemergence of jihadism in Iraq. Syria marked the transition. Despite the decision not to get involved, the administration seemingly couldn't help itself and launched one of the largest unacknowledged operations in modern times, according to the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Like every other U.S. intervention, it didn't bring victory, but it might well have prolonged the war and triggered Russian intervention. So, one way or another, it was consequential. The Obama administration's boldest initiative was negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, with the other members of the P5+1. But this had the additional virtue of creating an important condition for the rebalancing of U.S. power projection capability from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific. The U.S. pivot to Asia, the so-called pivot to Asia, was an important Obama priority. Currently, the U.S. maintains only relatively modest military presence in Iraq and Syria, and has withdrawn from the from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And although it promises a Middle East peace process, it has not yet unveiled the monument. And thus far, the administration has declined to use force against Iran. U.S. allies are increasingly wealthy and combine anxiety and self-confidence in ways that make them hard to satisfy. Regardless, they seem less inclined to follow the U.S. lead than in the past. This independent posture aligns well with the U.S. focus on Asia and perceptions here at home of sharply diminishing returns on the U.S. investment in maintaining the regional Middle Eastern order. Okay, so let me wrap up with two general statements, and neither of these, I think, will astound you. But just don't yawn. The first is that America's moment in the Middle East was a function of two interests, oil and Israel. During the Cold War, one could see how control of Middle Eastern oil would be strategically vital. And one could understand why policymakers tended, often incorrectly, to see the Soviets rather than local political developments as the key to events. The Al Saud and other wealthy Gulf families were important because they ruled where the oil deposits were. With the Cold War a distant memory and a different oil market regulating energy flows, the Persian Gulf doesn't have quite the same strategic salience as it once did. And Israel, at this stage, is more secure than ever and is correspondingly less inclined to follow Washington's lead. Israel's society has changed considerably in 70 years of statehood and in ways that militate against the kind of emotional relationship with the United States that many of us are accustomed to. The politicization of the relationship and the opposite directions in which Israeli and American society seem to be headed suggests that the future of the relationship will diverge from pre-existing patterns, from familiar patterns. And the region itself is struggling with a Cold War in which the U.S. has nothing significant at stake. My guess is that the pivot that began under Obama, therefore, will continue under Trump and into the next administration. Lastly, the Middle East, not everywhere certainly, but generally speaking, is saddled by serious problems, structural problems, that are well beyond America's ability to fix. A terrible labor supply overhang coupled with poor governance, weak economic performance, and systemic gender discrimination. These are challenges that the people of the region have to grapple with. U.S. interventions, which have killed hundreds of thousands of Arabs, have not helped, in my view. And we have not even mentioned the Tyrannosaurus rex in the room. The effect of climate change on the Gulf, the northern Levant, eastern Mediterranean, and North Africa. One can imagine turnaround scenarios and devoutly wish for them, but path dependencies can be very cruel. Thank you.